Abigail was sitting at the small kitchen table, with a heavy silence filling the room. In front of her, the health test results were spread out on the table, like a puzzle she didn't want to put together. Every line, every number, seemed to scream a truth she had avoided for years. His fingers trembled slightly as he held the paper that showed the alarming blood glucose levels. It was as if, suddenly, the entire reality of his health was revealed before his eyes, without filters, without any more excuses. The diagnosis of type 2 diabetes was nothing new for Abigail. She had already been living with the disease for years. However, things had never seemed so serious. She always thought she could control the situation, postponing dietary changes, avoiding exercise, and trusting that the medications would take care of everything. But now, over 62 and weighing over 180 pounds, the weight of her choices was beginning to manifest itself in ways she couldn't ignore. The doctor had been clear in the last consultation. He cited the increasing risk of serious complications, such as heart disease, kidney damage, and even vision problems. He spoke with a firm but empathetic tone, trying to make Abigail understand that time for significant changes was running out. "Abigail, if you don't do something now, it will be too late," he had said. At that moment, the words went in one ear and out the other, but now, alone in the kitchen, they resonated in his mind like a tireless echo. She got up and walked to the living room mirror. She looked at herself, at the reflection of a woman who carried the weight of many years of denial on her shoulders. The body that was once agile and light now felt tired and heavy. Abigail knew that the problem was not just the physical weight, but the emotional weight that came with it. She felt guilty for letting things get to this point. He blamed himself for every uncontrolled meal, for every time he chose to stay on the couch instead of taking a walk in the park. But at the same time, he knew that continuing to blame himself wouldn't change anything. It was time to face the facts. She returned to the table and looked at the papers once more. His glucose level was way beyond what was acceptable. Blood pressure was high, and cholesterol was not encouraging either. Each number felt like a sentence, as if his body was begging for help. Abigail felt a lump in her throat, and tears began to form in her eyes. She thought of her children, her grandchildren. They didn't deserve to see her suffer. She didn't want to be a limited grandmother who could barely play with the children because of her poor health. But more than that, Abigail didn't want to continue living in fear. The fear of a sudden complication. The fear that diabetes would take away his vision or worse, his life. She knew she needed to change, and she knew she needed to do it now. The challenge seemed immense. Every change, every step she needed to take, felt like a mountain to climb. Abigail had never been a person who was disciplined with her health. For her, comfort foods had always been an escape from difficult times, and the idea of giving up her old habits seemed painful. But what was more painful? Continue the way she was and face the terrible consequences, or finally decide to take care of herself. At that moment, Abigail made a decision. It wouldn't be easy, and she knew there would be times when she would feel weak, but something inside her told her she still had time. Time to change, to fight for your life, for your health. She looked at the scans once again, and instead of seeing scary numbers, she began to see an opportunity to rewrite your story. Diabetes didn't need to define who she was. She, Abigail, would be the one who would define her future. Abigail's story began many years ago, long before she even imagined that her health would reach the point it was at now. She has always been an active woman, full of life. When she was younger, she loved walking around her neighborhood, gardening, and even playing with her children. At that time, Abigail was healthy. There was no worry about weight or eating, because everything seemed to be under control. She ate whatever she wanted, without thinking about the consequences. But life, as we know, has its subtle ways of changing our habits, and that's what happened to Abigail. After her children grew up and left home, her routine changed drastically. Before, she ran from place to place, making dinners for the family, organizing the house, and taking care of the children. But suddenly, those commitments disappeared. Emptiness took over her time, and she began to find solace in something that had always been available to her: food. At first, they were small indulgences: an extra piece of cake after dinner, a quick snack in the afternoon, a dessert here and there to accompany the coffee. Abigail always justified herself, telling herself that it was okay to pamper herself a little. After all, she deserved it after years of taking care of others. However, what started as small slips soon became a constant habit. The plates became bigger, the meals became more caloric, and the time she spent taking care of her own health decreased day by day. Over the years, Abigail noticed that she was gaining weight, but never took it very seriously. At first, it was a few extra pounds. Nothing that a quick diet or a few weeks of exercise couldn't fix, she thought. But those weeks of exercise never came, and the diet was never more than a vague promise. As time passed, the number on the scale continued to rise, but Abigail always found excuses. "I'm busy. I'll start next Monday. It's just another piece of candy," she said to herself. The situation worsened when Abigail entered menopause. Her metabolism slowed, and the weight that once seemed easy to lose now became a burden she couldn't carry. Furthermore, the habits she had acquired over the years, meals rich in carbohydrates and sugar, lack of exercise, sedentary lifestyle, began to take their toll. She started to feel more tired, her joints hurt, and the energy she once had for walking around the neighborhood simply disappeared. Then came the diagnosis of diabetes. Abigail remembers that day well at the doctor's office. He explained that her blood glucose level was very high and that if she was not careful, her diabetes could cause serious complications. But at that time, Abigail did not understand the gravity of the situation. She thought she could continue living as she always had, just taking the prescribed medication. She didn't want to see that the problem wasn't just diabetes, but years of neglect with her health. Even after the diagnosis, Abigail continued to eat poorly. She still ate her favorite sweets, still refused to exercise, and still believed the consequences wouldn't be that bad. But as time went by, the weight continued to rise and the diabetes worsened. Visits to the doctor became more frequent, and with each visit the news was worse. Blood pressure was high, cholesterol was out of control, and the risk of heart problems was imminent. Now, sitting in her kitchen, looking at the exams in front of her, Abigail finally began to understand what she had done to herself. She realized that those little slip-ups, which in the past seemed so harmless, had accumulated over the years and turned into a much bigger problem than she could have ever imagined. Diabetes was no longer just a word in the diagnosis. It was a real threat to his life, and Abigail knew that if she wanted to continue living, she would have to do something to change this reality. This retrospective brought a flood of emotions to Abigail. Guilt, sadness, but also a small spark of hope. Because despite everything, she knew there was still time to change. Abigail was sitting in her favorite chair in the living room, her hands resting in her lap and her head full of thoughts. In recent days, the results of his health exams have been on his mind. She tried to divert her thoughts, distract herself with daily tasks, but she always ended up returning to that uncomfortable feeling of guilt and regret. How had he let his health get to that point? How did diabetes, the burden, and the complications of his condition become so great that they could no longer be ignored? She closed her eyes and took a deep breath, feeling the lump in her throat tighten. Abigail's first reaction was to try to deny the seriousness of her situation. She kept telling herself that it wasn't that serious, that things weren't that bad. "It's just a phase," she said softly, as if trying to convince herself that everything would soon return to normal, that with a few adjustments, everything would be fine. But the truth was different, and Abigail knew it. The doctor's words echoed in her mind. "If you don't change now, Abigail, you could face serious complications." Every time he remembered those words, the weight of guilt grew. She knew she could have done things differently, could have taken better care of herself over the years. He thought about the times he promised to start a diet, the walks he said he would take, the sweets he decided not to resist. He remembered every moment when he had the opportunity to change, but chose to continue in the same routine. "How did I get here?" she asked herself, feeling a mixture of sadness and frustration. Diabetes did not appear overnight. The extra pounds didn't come out of nowhere. There were years of small choices, decisions that seemed harmless at the time, but were now taking a heavy toll. Abigail wondered what would have happened if she had done things differently, if she had listened to the signals her body had been giving her for so long. But at the same time as she blamed herself, she also tried to justify her choices. After all, life was not easy. It had been very difficult to stay focused on your own health while taking care of your home, family, and work. The children grew up, and Abigail always prioritized others before herself. Comfort food was a way to deal with stress, and quick, calorie-packed routines were easier to maintain. She knew that in part, her choices were a reflection of the circumstances in which she lived. But the more I tried to justify it, the more painful it was to admit that, at some point, things could have been different. Abigail felt a tightness in her chest when she realized that the responsibility for her health was hers alone. Excuses that once seemed reasonable now seemed weak in the face of reality. She struggled with these feelings of guilt, but she knew she could no longer ignore what was happening. The pain of knowing that I could have avoided all of that was immense. If you had started taking better care of yourself years ago, you might not be facing so many complications now. The diabetes, the excess weight, the high blood pressure. It all seemed to be the result of a series of decisions that, at the time, seemed small, but which, when added together, brought her to where she was now. Abigail slowly got up and walked to the window, looking at the cloudy sky. Outside, the world continued its course, indifferent to his internal struggle. She knew she couldn't change the past, but the guilt was still there, like a shadow that followed her. And no matter how much she tried to escape, she knew that the only way to move forward was to face the truth once and for all. Abigail was sitting in the waiting room of the doctor's office, with her hands clasped in her lap, trying to calm her rapidly beating heart. She knew this moment was important, but she wasn't prepared for what was to come. When she was finally called, she entered the room with a nervous smile, trying to remain calm. The doctor greeted her kindly, but soon his face became serious. He was holding the results of Abigail's most recent exams, and from the look in his eyes, she knew the situation was not good. Sitting in the chair in front of the doctor, Abigail listened attentively as he began to speak. The tone was calm, but the words were harsh. He explained that Abigail's blood glucose levels were alarmingly high and that her diabetes was progressing dangerously. "Abigail," he said, looking directly at her, "you need to understand that if you don't make changes now, the consequences will be serious." She felt a chill run down her spine, but she kept her gaze fixed on the doctor, trying to absorb every word. The doctor continued explaining the risks. Heart disease was among the most likely complications. He talked about how uncontrolled diabetes can damage blood vessels, making it difficult to pump blood to the heart. That, in itself, was a huge risk. Abigail had never thought that her condition could directly affect the heart, but there was the truth, stated bluntly. He also mentioned the kidneys. Abigail almost choked in surprise when he explained that, over time, diabetes could seriously compromise the functioning of the kidneys, even leading to kidney failure. She never imagined something like this could happen to her. He'd always heard stories of people facing serious complications, but he never thought this would be such a close reality. As the doctor described each risk, Abigail began to feel a growing fear. She couldn't imagine her life like this, with illnesses that would limit her completely. What scared her most was the possibility of losing her autonomy, of no longer being able to take care of herself. The doctor was direct. "If you don't change now, Abigail, you could face complications such as heart attacks, strokes, and even amputations." That last word echoed in his mind, amputations. The idea of losing a part of your body, of losing your freedom to move, was terrifying. Abigail looked at her shaking hands. Until that moment, she had convinced herself that she still had time, that she could keep putting off the changes she knew she needed to make. But now, the doctor's words sounded like an ultimatum. There was no more time to waste. The idea of a limited life, of depending on other people to do simple things like walk or get out of bed, terrified her. The doctor, noticing the terror on Abigail's face, softened his tone but maintained the urgency. "You can still change this, Abigail, but you need to act now." He explained that, with changes in diet, regular exercise, and adequate medical monitoring, it was possible to control diabetes and avoid these complications. It was as if he was offering her one last chance. Abigail left the appointment in shock. The doctor's words were running around in her head, and the fear of losing her autonomy was what shook her the most. She was always independent, always took care of herself and others. The idea of depending on someone for simple things scared her deeply. As he walked home, he felt the weight of his choices over the years and realized that if he didn't do something now, he really could lose everything he valued. The consultation was a watershed moment. Fear haunted her, but at the same time, it began to transform into a force that pushed her towards change. She knew the path would be difficult, but she also knew that she needed to fight for her health, her independence, and the life she still had ahead of her. Abigail was sitting alone in her living room. The house was silent, and everything seemed a little heavier that day. She knew something needed to change, but she didn't know where to start. Her health was at risk, that was undeniable. But the idea of making such a huge transformation in her life scared her. She was always stubborn. She always thought she could handle everything alone. But now, looking at her own reality, she realized that the situation was different. Her diabetes was out of control, her weight was a burden, and she increasingly felt like her energy was slipping away. While looking out the window, observing the gray late afternoon sky, Abigail began to talk to herself. It was one of those internal conversations she usually avoided, but this time there was no escaping it. "Why did I let things get to this point?" she asked herself, feeling a lump in her throat. The promises she had made to herself over the years came back to her. How many times did she say she would start taking care of her health next week? How many times have you postponed starting a new routine? The fear of failing was always present. Abigail knew that to improve her condition, she would need to make drastic changes in her diet, in her exercise, in the way she viewed her own health. But the fear of not being able to maintain these changes paralyzed her. She was afraid to start and give up, as she had done so many times before. "What if I try and it doesn't work?" she thought, feeling the weight of responsibility increasing. The idea of failing seemed stronger than the desire to try. But at the same time, there was another side inside her that screamed for change. Abigail knew she wanted to live better. I wanted to feel lighter, healthier. I wanted to do things again that I hadn't been able to do in a long time. The desire to live without so many limitations, without the constant fear of a health complication, drove her. She thought about her grandchildren, about the games she avoided because she got tired too quickly, about the family gatherings where she felt ashamed of her condition. Abigail wanted to be present on these occasions. She wanted to truly participate without the limitations that her body now imposed. This conflict between the fear of failure and the desire to live better was a constant battle in his mind. On the one hand, the feeling that any change would be too difficult, that it might be too late to try. On the other, a growing desire to take care of herself, to do something for herself before it was too late. "I can't live like this anymore," she murmured, her voice breaking. Abigail knew that, for any change to happen, it would have to start slowly, one step at a time. It wouldn't be easy, but nothing really worth it was. She felt the weight of responsibility like never before. It wasn't just about losing weight or managing diabetes. It was about getting your life back, about feeling like you still had control over your body and your future. The difficulty of starting paralyzed her. She thought about the daily temptations, the fresh bread for breakfast, the sweets she loved so much, the laziness that prevented her from getting up and going for a walk. It was these little things that seemed huge now. Every wrong choice in the past became an obstacle in the present. "Can I?" she asked herself, doubting herself, but at the same time knowing that she had no other options. She closed her eyes and took a deep breath. The fear was there. It was undeniable, but there was also a strength inside her that was beginning to grow. Abigail knew she could no longer ignore her health. "I knew that the only way to live in better conditions was to face fear head-on. Maybe she would fail sometimes. Maybe the path would be full of stumbles, but giving up now would be the biggest mistake of all." At that moment, Abigail decided that she would try. She didn't know how or where she would start, but one thing was certain. She could no longer live with the fear of failure controlling her decisions. The desire to live better, to feel good, to be there for those I loved, was stronger than any fear. And that, she knew, was the first step in a long journey. Abigail had finally made a decision. After many sleepless nights, full of doubts and fears, she decided it was time to change. The doctor had been clear about the risks she was taking, and the weight of that reality hung over her like a dark cloud. But instead of letting herself be paralyzed by fear, Abigail decided to use this concern as an impetus. She knew she had to start somewhere, and even if the first steps were small, they would take her in a new direction. That morning, instead of getting lost in the routines that always made her return to the same habits, Abigail sat at the table with a plan. "I knew there was no point in promising a radical change from one day to the next, but I could make adjustments that would make a difference over time." The first thing she decided to change was her diet. Abigail has always been passionate about cooking, and even more so, eating. Cakes, pies, pasta, everything with lots of flavor and lots of fat. But now she needed to find a way to continue enjoying these pleasures without harming her health. She began researching alternatives. It was then that he discovered our recipe book specially developed for diabetics. The title promised what she was looking for: healthier versions of her favorite dishes, without sacrificing flavor. Abigail, curious and hopeful, ordered the book, and when it arrived in her email, she felt as if she had a key to a new life. As she read, she found recipes that made her smile. There were her beloved dishes, like lasagna, carrot cake, and homemade bread, all adapted with lighter ingredients, less sugar, and healthier options she had never considered. With her cell phone in her hands, Abigail began transforming her kitchen. He replaced the ingredients he always used with healthier alternatives. Instead of white flour, use wholemeal flour. Sugar was swapped for natural sweeteners, and fats were replaced with lighter oils and fruits. That day, she decided to test one of her favorite recipes: pancakes. He'd always loved waking up on Sunday mornings and making pancakes for breakfast, but now he knew he needed a more health-friendly version. Following the recipe in our book, Abigail prepared the dough with ingredients she had never tried before. And to her surprise, the result was delicious. The pancakes were fluffy and delicious, and for the first time in a long time, she felt like she could continue to enjoy the flavors she loved without feeling guilty. The first step seemed small, but the psychological impact was profound. Abigail realized that she didn't need to give up everything she liked to take care of her health. All you had to do was make better choices. With her diet gradually adjusted, Abigail began to include small physical activities in her routine. She knew she needed to move more, but the idea of heavy exercise still scared her. So he decided to start with something simple: hiking. At first, it was just 10 minutes a day, walking around the block. But every day, she felt a little stronger, a little more willing. And over time, the walks began to last longer, and Abigail began to feel the difference in her body and mind. The walk, as well as the changes in diet, seemed like simple gestures. But for Abigail, these small steps symbolized something much bigger. Every healthy meal, every walk around the neighborhood, were reminders that she was doing something for herself, something that mattered. The feeling of control over her own life that she thought she had lost was slowly returning. The fear that once consumed her now seemed a little more distant. As the days passed, Abigail began to notice the changes. She felt less tired, her mood improved, and her relationship with food became less about guilt and more about conscious pleasure. She still liked to eat well, but now she understood that she could do it in a balanced way without compromising her health. This beginning of the journey was not just about losing weight or controlling diabetes. For Abigail, it was about regaining the feeling of being in control, of believing that there was still time to improve, to live well, and above all, to feel good. The psychological impact was profound, and she realized that every small victory, whether it was a healthy meal, a walk, or a new recipe, was an important step on her journey to a healthier, more balanced life. And if you want to change your routine like Abigail, with our recipe book, she transformed her diet in a healthy and delicious way. If you have diabetes, kidney or liver problems, or high blood pressure, and are tired of bland recipes, these recipes can help you just like they helped Abigail. For less than $10, you can secure your copy, but the units at this price are limited. So click on the first comment on this video and secure yours now. Abigail was determined to change. She had already taken her first steps, adjusting her diet and starting to walk daily. She felt lighter, both physically and emotionally, and there was a sense of control she hadn't felt in a long time. However, as the days went by, Abigail began to realize something that scared her. Old habits were always nearby, waiting for a moment of weakness. One afternoon, after a particularly difficult week at work, Abigail found herself sitting at the kitchen table, looking at the cupboard where she kept her cookies and sweets. That same closet that she had sworn not to open again now seemed to almost call her. She knew she shouldn't eat it. She knew these foods had been her escape for years, but tiredness and stress were taking a toll. It's just a cookie, she thought, trying to convince herself. One won't hurt me. But deep down, Abigail knew it wasn't just a cookie. It was the temptation to return to the path she had fought so hard to leave behind. For a few minutes, she stood still, looking at the closet, trying to decide whether to give in to the urge. At that moment, she remembered all the other times she had told herself the same thing. It's just once. I deserve it. I'm tired. Just a little longer and then I'll stop. It was these small concessions that over the years had gotten her to where she was before she decided to change. But now, even knowing this, the temptation was real, and Abigail questioned whether she would really be able to maintain these changes in the long term. These moments of doubt came up often. There were days when Abigail followed everything as planned, eating well and going for walks. But in others, the desire to return to the old routine of comfort food and a sedentary lifestyle was strong. That piece of cake after dinner seemed like such a simple way to relax after a stressful day. And the sofa, with its promise of rest, called louder than the idea of going out for a walk. Abigail began to realize that changing her habits would not just be a matter of deciding once and moving on. The struggle would be constant, with ups and downs, and she would need to remember why she started. Even with all her good intentions, she knew that the old pattern that had kept her trapped for so long was always lurking, waiting for an opportunity to reappear. On one of those difficult days, Abigail gave in. He ate something he knew he shouldn't have. The guilt came almost immediately, an internal voice reminding her how hard she had tried to change and how this could be a step backwards. Why do I keep coming back to this? She asked herself, frustrated with herself. Will I be able to maintain these changes? Doubts accumulated in his mind. It was as if every time she gave in to an old habit, the feeling of failure sank her even deeper. Abigail knew that true change took time, but at that moment, the weight of the journey seemed overwhelming. She felt torn between the desire to continue and the tiredness of always fighting against herself. However, even in the face of these difficulties, Abigail realized that, unlike in the past, there was now a difference. She was aware of temptations and could see their patterns of behavior. Before, she let herself be carried away without thinking, but now she could identify the exact moment when she was about to give in. And that, no matter how small, was progress. I knew that giving in to temptation was part of the process, but the most important thing was to get up and continue. Thus, Abigail decided that, although old habits still haunted her, they would not define her future. It was normal to waver from time to time, but what mattered was the commitment to always get back on the right path. Abigail was sitting in the living room, reflecting on her journey there. She had taken her first steps, made some changes to her diet, and incorporated small physical activities into her routine. But the weight of temptations, the difficulties of maintaining these choices, and the frequent slips were beginning to wear her down. It was then that, in a moment of deep reflection, Abigail realized that she didn't need to go through this alone. She had always tried to be strong, to face everything with her own strength, but now she understood that asking for help was not a sign of weakness, but rather a way of ensuring that she could continue moving forward. Abigail began to talk more openly with her friends and family about the difficulties she was facing. Sharing her struggle was liberating, and to her surprise, she found more support than she imagined. Her sister, always so close, started going hiking with her on the weekends. Having someone by your side during these walks made all the difference. Conversations flowed as they walked, and time seemed to pass faster. Abigail felt lighter, both physically and emotionally, when she realized that there was now a support network around her. One afternoon, while talking to a longtime friend, Abigail heard about a support group for people who, like her, were trying to change their lifestyle habits. At first, Abigail was hesitant. She had never been the type to share her difficulties with strangers. But something inside her encouraged her to try. Maybe hearing other people's stories, knowing that they were also facing the same challenges, could be the boost they needed to stay strong. At the group's first meeting, Abigail arrived nervous. He entered the room with several chairs arranged in a circle and saw other people sitting, ready to share their own struggles. She felt a comforting warmth as she realized that each of those people was also there to seek help, to give and receive support. When it was Abigail's turn to speak, her words came out hesitantly at first. But as she told her story, about the ups and downs, about how difficult it was to resist temptation, and how frustrated she was with her own mistakes, she realized that no one was judging her. On the contrary, everyone there understood what she was going through. It was as if, for the first time, Abigail allowed herself to be vulnerable, and in return, she received a wave of empathy and understanding. After she finished speaking, a woman in the group looked her in the eyes and said, "I understand you. I've been there too, and it's difficult, but we're all in this together." These words touched Abigail in a profound way. She was no longer alone. As the weeks went by, Abigail began attending the support group regularly. She listened attentively to others' stories, each one full of struggles and achievements. Little by little, he began to share his small successes too. He talked about walks with his sister, about the healthy recipes he was learning to make. With each meeting, Abigail felt stronger, more confident that she could maintain the changes she so desired. The support of friends and family, combined with the strength she found in the group, made Abigail realize that, although the journey was hers, she didn't need to walk alone. There were people around him willing to help, to hold his hand in difficult times. And this feeling of support was exactly what was needed for Abigail to start believing that this time, she would really make it. With each step, Abigail felt more firm in her decision. The fear of failure, which once consumed her, began to subside. Now, when temptations arose, she knew she had someone to turn to. A text to her sister, a call to her friend from the support group. It all helped her stay focused and motivated. Abigail finally understood that, with the right support, the chances of success were much greater. And most importantly, she realized that this change was not temporary, but the beginning of a new phase in her life. Over the months, Abigail began to notice something that seemed distant at the beginning of her journey, the first signs that her changes were working. In the beginning, everything seemed difficult, and the victories were almost invisible. However, little by little, small achievements began to emerge, and these achievements, however small they were, brought her new enthusiasm. The first thing Abigail noticed was the lightness in her body. The days when climbing the stairs was a tiring task have begun to be left behind. Now each step seemed less challenging, and little by little she began to feel like she was regaining the energy she had lost. The mirror, which previously reflected his discouragement, now showed something different. She no longer had to try so hard to see the difference. Her face was brighter, and the clothes that had previously seemed tight were now a little looser. The weight loss was visible, but more than that, she felt the change internally. With each visit to the doctor, the results of his tests brought good news. Blood pressure, which had previously been a constant cause for concern, began to stabilize. Diabetes, which had always seemed out of control, was now being managed more effectively. Abigail couldn't believe it when the doctor told her that her glucose levels were approaching balance. It was as if, finally, all the effort was paying off. These small victories not only improved his physical health, but also had a profound impact on his mind. Before, each day felt like an endless struggle, as if all your attempts to improve were in vain. But with each positive result, Abigail began to believe that change was possible. The discouragement that accompanied her at the beginning of the journey was replaced by a growing determination. Abigail remembered how difficult it was in the beginning, dealing with the frustration of not seeing immediate results, facing daily temptations, and the constant feeling that she would never achieve it. But now, with every little improvement, she felt like she was getting stronger. What once seemed impossible was becoming real, and his confidence in his own abilities grew every day. His friends and family started to notice too. Comments about how happier and healthier she seemed started to come up in casual conversation. Her sister, who always walked beside her, smiled when she saw the sparkle in Abigail's eyes. It was as if, finally, she was finding herself again. And that, for Abigail, was more valuable than any number on the scale. In addition to the praise, Abigail noticed another important change. The activities that previously tired her were now part of her routine without so much effort. Walking around the block, which at first felt like a chore, now felt almost natural. With each walk, she felt stronger, more determined to continue. She felt like her body was responding to the care she had neglected for so long. But what really motivated her were the simple everyday moments. When Abigail woke up in the morning, she no longer felt the overwhelming tiredness that prevented her from getting up willingly. Now there was a lightness to her awakening, a pleasure in starting the day knowing that every healthy choice she made brought her closer to her goals. These small victories fueled his inner strength. Every healthy meal, every conscious choice, every time she resisted the temptation to return to her old habits was a step toward the life she always wanted. Abigail knew there was still a long way to go, but now she walked with the certainty that she was capable. Each positive result reminded her that her efforts were not in vain. Abigail, who once doubted her ability to change, was now determined to continue. Every improvement, no matter how small, made her believe in herself more. Each new achievement strengthened his will to move forward. Stabilized blood pressure, diabetes control, and weight loss were more than just test results. They were symbols of his determination and strength. She had learned to value these small victories because they were what sustained her through difficult times. And now, more than ever, Abigail knew that the journey was hers, but that, with each step, she was getting closer to the healthy and balanced life she always dreamed of. Abigail was sitting on the porch of her house, watching the sky that slowly changed color at dusk. The light breeze caressed her face, and she took a deep breath, as if absorbing not just the air, but all the learning and changes that had occurred along her journey. Looking back, she remembered how it all started. The struggles, the setbacks, the moments of doubt. But now she felt different, as if a new Abigail had been born in the midst of so much effort. It wasn't just her body that had changed. It was her mind, her spirit, and most importantly, her way of seeing herself in the world. At first, Abigail thought that changing was a matter of willpower, and indeed, it was. But what she didn't know, and what she only discovered over time, was that changing her lifestyle was much more than resisting temptation or following a diet. It was about taking care of yourself, prioritizing yourself. Over the months, Abigail learned that the real secret was in balance. She didn't need to be perfect. She didn't need to follow strict rules all the time. The important thing was to be aware of your choices and understand that taking care of yourself was an act of love. When she looked back at her journey, Abigail didn't just see the pounds lost or the test results improving. I saw a much deeper transformation. Now she was someone who understood the importance of self-care, who knew that her health was a priority. Abigail had learned to listen to her body and respect its limits. The fear of future complications that had previously haunted her was now replaced by a sense of control and confidence. She fondly remembered the moment she decided to invest in a healthy cookbook. That small decision seemed insignificant at the time, but it was a turning point in his life. The book not only offered alternatives to the foods I loved so much, but also opened the door to a new way of seeing food, as an ally, not an enemy. Abigail started having fun in the kitchen, trying new ingredients, discovering flavors she had never tried before. That's how she realized that eating healthy didn't have to be boring or limiting. On the contrary, it was liberating. Now, Abigail reflected on how grateful she was for having made this choice. Taking care of your diet was one of the foundations of your transformation. She understood that by making small substitutions, swapping processed foods for more natural options, reducing sugar consumption, and including more vegetables and whole grains in her diet, she was building a new life, a healthier and more balanced life, and most importantly, she was doing it for herself. Abigail knew that, although the journey had been difficult, the real challenge was in maintaining what she had achieved. But unlike before, now she didn't see it as an obligation. It was a conscious choice, a commitment to your own happiness. And that choice was something she was willing to make every day, no matter how small the steps. As the sun sank below the horizon, Abigail felt an inner peace that she had never felt before. She knew that her care journey did not end there, that the process of taking care of herself was continuous. But now she was equipped with knowledge, strength, and a new perspective on life. It wasn't just about following rules or worrying about the scale. It was about living in a balanced way, making healthy choices consciously, and understanding that your health was the basis for a fulfilling life. When reflecting on all this, Abigail felt it was time to share what she had learned, to alert people who, like her, might be lost or unsure of where to start. She wanted everyone to know that change was possible, but that it didn't have to be radical. The first step could be as simple as gaining knowledge, like she did by purchasing a healthy cookbook. This simple decision made your journey easier, making it lighter and more enjoyable. And then, looking directly into the video camera, Abigail left an important warning for anyone listening. Small adjustments to your diet can change your life. Replacing processed ingredients with natural and healthy options is the first step to regaining control over your health. Prevention starts in your kitchen. Invest in knowledge. Take care of what you eat, because in the end, taking care of your diet is the best way to avoid complications in the future. First step. With these words, Abigail knew that she was fulfilling another mission on her journey. She had learned, and now she wanted others to have the chance to change their lives, one step at a time. Don't forget that the link to our recipe book for diabetics is in the first comment. Get yours now. Now that you've heard Abigail's story and want to take a step to change your diet and can't invest in our cookbook, I'm leaving a playlist with the best videos about the best and worst foods for diabetics. Click now and watch. I'll wait for you there.